Really appreciate everyone joining us today. I know it's a mid-summer webinar, so it's always a little bit more of a maybe your calendars or have more time on them, but we know that it's a commitment to be here with us and one that you've made that we appreciate. So as mentioned, we are here today for the OA Alliance webinar exploring the relationship between ocean acidification and food security. For those of you that I have not met, my name is Jessie Turner. I'm the director of the Ocean Acidification Alliance and really happy to be here as MC today with some great presenters and some great panel discussion to follow. We are going to have about 90 minutes, so please account for that. We might end a little bit early if we wrap, but that's about a 90-minute webinar, so we'll end in an hour and a half. And we will, I'll talk a little bit about our speakers and the type of conversation we want to have today. But just to get started, I'll introduce the conversation to say ocean acidification is already causing changes in ocean, coastal, and marine species and ecosystems that millions of people rely on for food. And while there is a large body of research on the relationship between acidification and food security, there are only emerging publications that are really starting to look at the impacts and the required policy responses of the impacts of climate change, both on large scale and small scale fisheries. There is a body of work on that type of policy response. But what we're really going to talk about today is how acidification remains a little under-examined in relationship to food security policy. And how do we close the gap or introduce acidification impacts as one extra way that we are thinking about climate resilient food security policy? So that's what we're going to be up to today. We're going to begin with a little bit of a state of the science and the impacts of acidification on seafood species, talk about some of the policy briefs, initiatives that are examining the relationship between climate change and blue foods, and then hopefully move into a discussion about enhancing governance and financing to support or to more adequately, I guess, support nations and regions in prolonged climate ocean adaptation efforts with an emphasis on food security. And as mentioned, I'll go panelists, but we will begin before our great set of panelists. Maybe I'll cue this up in a second. I wanted to turn it over to our dear colleague, Dr. Alicia Harold Khalib, with the School of Agriculture, Food, and Ecosystem Sciences at the Faculty of Science, University of Melbourne in Australia. Dr. Harold Khalib has been partnered with the OA Alliance on a paper that she will introduce in a short 5-minute video just to orient us a little bit more in acidification impacts, and particularly as they relate to the 6 dimensions of food security as conceptualized by a high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition. So while folks are joining, I'll go ahead and play this short video as an intro and a little bit of positioning on how we are thinking about acidification in the context of the 6 dimensions of food security.
Hello everyone, my name is Alicia Harold Khalib from the University of Melbourne, and it's a pleasure to present this very quick summary of some of the work that we've been doing around ocean acidification and food security. Apologies for not being able to present this live. Unfortunately, it's about midnight my time.
Jessie, we can't hear the video.
My fault, I muted myself there.
3 billion people seed provide at least 20% of their daily intake of animal protein, and for some this is much, much higher. Ocean acidification, however, is undermining this relationship between people and the sea and is likely to already be impacting some of the components of food security of some people and communities. So what is it that we mean when we talk about the components of food security? We're referring here to the 6 dimensions of agency, stability, sustainability, access, availability, and utilisation, as outlined by the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition. It is here that they conceptualise food security as existing when all people at all times have the physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious foods that meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So this is what our food systems should provide to every human. And in many cases, the global food systems can act as a redundancy for the effects on local systems. However, there are some people who are so heavily reliant on local foods that local effects, such as ocean acidification, can severely undermine one or more of these dimensions and therefore threaten food security. In our analysis, we've explored how each of these 6 dimensions may be undermined by ocean acidification. We've conceptualised the relationship between ocean acidification and food security as a sort of pyramid with sustainability, stability and availability at the foundation, as it's these 3 dimensions that ocean acidification can most directly undermine and that can then have a trickle-up effect, destabilising the higher components of the pyramid. We understand that these dimensions are interlinked in a variety of ways and not necessarily linked. They're also contingent upon each other and all need to be met in order to fulfill food security. Over the long term, ocean acidification causes effects at the individual, population, and ecosystem levels, which can undermine a constant food source. For example, as coral reefs shift to a state of dissolution, they will no longer be able to provide critical habitat for many fish populations and other species that are relied on by coastal communities, thereby undermining the sustainability of a constant food source. Ocean acidification can also cause short-term shocks. For example, we've seen this when coupled with upwelling, as was experienced along the west coast of the US, which led to oyster hatchery die-offs during upwelling periods. This undermined the reliability of food being there when needed, or the stability of these stocks. As species are impacted at the individual, population and ecosystem levels, some simply won't be available when needed. Declines in habitat and shifting species can also result in reduced physical access. Additionally, lower harvests can reduce income and economic access to food, as can the increasing prices of blue foods. OA can also alter the taste of food. Studies have shown that some species become less tasty when raised in more acidic conditions. Ocean acidification has also been found to increase the uptake and bioaccumulation of heavy metals and toxins, thereby making food less safe and less nutritious. And lastly, disruptions in locally available foods can reduce culturally appropriate foods. Moreover, agency is not just about having the choice of what food to eat and when, but it's also about food sovereignty and having control over management and policy decisions. And when we're thinking about ocean acidification, given the global nature of it, many local communities don't have the ability to really input into those global policy processes. Therefore, when we think about agency, we need to think not just at the local food choice level, but also how are these communities able to actually make decisions about all the other components, stability, sustainability and availability of their food stocks. So what is it that we hope you take away from this research? It's that ocean acidification can act to undermine food security in a variety of ways, and that there is a need for a greater recognition of this nexus in both policymaking and research. Ultimately, the 6 dimensions give us a series of different touch points at which we can make interventions either in the research or policymaking to protect food security from the advance of ocean acidification. We need to have greater recognition of this nexus at the local, national and international levels in order to really protect food security in the future from ocean acidification. I hope you've enjoyed this very short presentation. Happy to talk more about this. Please feel free to reach out, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar. Thank you very much. Bye.
Wonderful.
Hello, everyone. My name
Well, thank you all so much for participating and listening to that video. Hopefully, we've got more folks joining now, and our doorbells will go down a little bit. But really appreciate Alicia setting the tone and really introducing the policy brief, which we will share out with you all in the chat and obviously in a follow-up email to everyone that registered. So to follow that really great sort of tone setting on how we're thinking about acidification in the context of food security, it is my pleasure to introduce the two presentations that we're going to have this morning. First, from Dr. Annika Frosch, who's with the Bartlett School of Environment, Energy, and Resources at University College London in the United Kingdom. Annika is going to give us a little bit of an overview of acidification as an emerging governance challenge and really thinking about responsibilities of international governance. From there, we'll turn it over to Carly Kelso, who is the Director of Climate Resilient Food Systems at Environmental Defense Fund, to talk a little bit about the creation of the Aquatic Blue Foods Coalition and specifically some of the outcomes from the recent Our Ocean Conference, which occurred in Mombasa, Kenya last month. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you, Annika, to tell us what you know.
Thank you, Jessie. Once you stop sharing, I'll try to share mine. Okay, can you confirm that you can see that, please?
Looks great.
Okay. All right. As Jesse already mentioned, I will be talking about ocean acidification governance. I think when we're moving between these two topics, like ocean acidification and food security, it's really important kind of to understand where are the governance challenges and the problems that we look at. Ellie before me has already kind of put them together a little and said, okay, here's clearly a problem, and these things will be influencing each other. But maybe for those who are not as familiar with ocean acidification, here's like a bit of a recap, and then we'll move into food security afterwards. Um, but before I start really with ocean acidification, I always like to point out when we want to try to govern an issue, we really need to understand the science that is behind the problem, because otherwise we really won't be able to do that. A lot of people are always like, well, I'm a lawyer, I'm a policymaker. I don't really fully understand the background of the problem I'm dealing with, but I think it's actually really important. And why that is, I put some of these reasons on the slide here, but this is certainly not a comprehensive list. First things first, I think without understanding the science behind a problem, we will never understand what the problem actually is and how to tell it apart from other issues. Like, for example, ocean acidification and climate change, they're often being put together. They're treated as the same thing, but it's not that simple, as you will see in a second. It also helps us identify where to actually look for example, relevant actors, as well as the policy fields and laws that could govern an issue. So for ocean acidification, we have to not just look at the ocean, we also have to look at land, we have to look at the atmosphere to really know where those actors are sitting. And in addition to that, we really can understand which actors are more qualified to deal with this problem than others. So that includes, for example, what is this actor supposed to be doing? So what to do for mitigation and adaptation, for example, in the case of ocean acidification. So you can see it is really essential that we understand the science before we move into the policy. That being said, I guess the question is, what do we actually know about ocean acidification? And actually, it is more than you would think. This is one of the highly studied topics in oceanography since 2005. So we actually have more information than most people think on the scientific side. But I don't want to go through all the details here because I know it's quite a complex chemical issue. But I just want to give you an overview of what actually triggers ocean acidification. So first, the number one reason for ocean acidification is emission of CO2 emissions that are then absorbed by the ocean and lead to a change in pH and therefore ocean acidification. That being said, this is not the only source of or trigger of ocean acidification. Ocean acidification can also be triggered by land-based pollution, for example, from urbanization and agriculture runoff, that including nitrates, like here, this is just an example, but also phosphates, etc., that then end up in the ocean, are being used for photosynthesis by algae, And when these algae die, they release the CO2 that they have absorbed in the process again and in the decomposition process. So the CO2 is actually, especially in lower water levels in front of the coastline, that really leads to these hotspots of ocean acidification. So we shouldn't forget about that because actually for ecosystems that are situated close to the coastline, this is a huge problem. There's another space we should be watching when we talk about ocean acidification, and that is the so-called geoengineering or marine carbon dioxide removal space. Well, this is not leading to ocean acidification right now by any means. It is a space you should be watching because these technologies are trying to draw atmospheric CO2 into the ocean with different technologies, obviously in order to prevent further warming. But some of these technologies, if they're not being done correctly, might lead to more ocean acidification. So this is just the space that we should be watching and ensure that it's being done correctly. Then we have ocean acidification that can be caused also by NOx and SOx. Those NOx and SOx are being released by all sorts of industries, including the shipping industry, for example. And usually they end up in the ocean because they're washed out through rain, as acid rain, which you probably have heard of, into the ocean water. And unfortunately, or fortunately to some extent, the shipping industry, because of these NOx and SOx, have been starting to put stricter regulations when it comes to releasing them into the atmosphere. However, then a lot of ships have decided instead of releasing them into the atmosphere, we release them into the water as acid wash by so-called scrubbers or exhaust gas cleaning systems, which actually releases really acid wash and leads to ocean acidification in shipping lanes and also close to harbors. But when we talk about ocean acidification, we can't really just think about ocean acidification alone because there's also other stressors that we need to talk and think about as they can accumulate with ocean acidification, lead to real issues like, for example, food security. And those are, of course, all the other impacts of climate change, including, for example, the warming of the ocean, sea level rise, etc. But it could also be overfishing and all those other ones that you're probably aware of. Um, the last thing that we really have to always think about when we think about ocean acidification is adaptation, and that adaptation can be by the species themselves, or it can also be by human beings. How do we actually adapt to the changes of the ocean? So you can already see it as quite a complex issue. We have to think about a lot of different areas when we think about ocean acidification, and it involves not just the ocean, it involves also land and atmosphere, for example. So there's different Earth spheres at hand here that we can look at when we're looking at actors and instruments. There's also, I always say, two different dimensions. One is global and one is local, as I kind of already explained, where at the global dimension, the triggers are global and the impact is global. On the local level, it is the triggers are local and the impact will be local. Then there's also a time dimension because when we're dealing with climate change and CO2 as part of that, we should already think about how to deal with land-based pollution because the political stakes at this is way lower since there's only one actor or maybe so one country or maybe a region of countries involved in this and not the entire state community. So it might be easier to deal with it right now. So now that we know kind of what ocean acidification is and where it comes from, who should then be dealing with ocean acidification? Like who is the actor that we should be looking at to deal with this problem? And which political instruments or which legal instruments are the right ones? Well, this is a question that I have spent a lot of time thinking about through my entire PhD and also when I started becoming a research fellow. And I created a huge map with all the ones that are out there. And a baby version of this map is here on the slide. Um, so on the left side, you can see the actors. So when I talk about actors, I usually mean this can be everything from international organizations to NGOs. They can be private, then it can be public, or they can be mixed. So everything you can kind of think about that operates on the international, but also on the regional, sometimes on the local scale that could deal with this issue, I have thought about in the bigger map, don't you worry. All these actors are not necessarily having ocean acidification as their main concern. The only one that we have and that actually could find that primarily deals with ocean acidification is the Ocean Acidification Alliance. But every other actor actually just deals with issues that are related to ocean acidification, like geoengineering or shipping. So, for example, we have on the left side here the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, which is the organization that deals mostly with shipping, but it can also deal with geoengineering, for example. So you can see how this map came together. And on the right side, these are the instruments. Mostly these have been created by the actors on the left. And they're kind of covering the issues that I have mentioned and how they relate to the actors. So the IMO, for example, has created MAPO and the LCLP, and those are instruments that deal with emissions, for example, or geoengineering. One that everyone really likes to talk about when it comes to ocean acidification is, of course, the climate change regime, which you can see on the right side with the arrow. Of course, that makes sense because CO2 is, after all, a greenhouse gas, and it is the climate change regime is really there to deal with this number one cause of ocean acidification, which is CO2 emissions. However, we should really point out that greenhouse gases are more than just CO2, and there are no specific targets to deal with CO2 specifically. So, as you can see, even the climate change regime can't really neatly fit ocean acidification within it. So, you can see this is a really difficult problem, and we don't really know where to fit it as of now. So why are there so many in charge? I mean, there's no clear answer, but the best guess is to say, well, you have seen it is a complex problem. There's different dimensions like time and space and different environmental spheres like ocean, land, and atmosphere. So of course it makes sense that so many different ones are dealing with different aspects of ocean acidification and could be in charge of dealing with this issue. So overall, it leaves us with a complex problem to solve. Really addressing ocean acidification requires a multi-level approach. As I already said, there's land-based pollution that deals or leads to ocean acidification as well as global, as well as shipping. As you know, we have seen the entire map, and it's really not that simple. And so there's no one size fits all solution. So we really have to see like the local level is not the same as the global, and even within different local levels, we can't necessarily compare Germany to Chile, for example. And while we have to learn from each other, we definitely need to have dedicated data and understanding per region and how to deal with the species that are impacted there. So ocean acidification governance needs to be adjustable and it needs to be flexible because we're still learning about this problem. Even though this is one of the most researched issues of oceanography, we still don't know everything and we don't have the full technology either. So whatever we do for governance, it should be able to change if need be. So this situation, I know that's quite academic, but we call this a regime complex. This is a situation that we have when there's no clear hierarchy. No one is clearly in charge of this problem, but there's many that take a piece of it. So that's why in the literature people are saying, well, what do we do now? For example, do we need a new treaty on ocean acidification? I can tell you from my experience in working in politics, like we are not in a position where we have the time or the political will to do that right now, unfortunately. So a lot of people recognize that and they say maybe we can add on to a different treaty that we already have. Unfortunately, there also political will and time is needed. I have been working on the MAPO Convention where we're trying to, so that's the one the International Maritime Organization is preparing, or we are preparing a new annex to that to cover climate change from shipping emissions. And that has been a really long and painful process. And in the end, now we're almost there, but again, political will is missing. Nevertheless, I wouldn't want to give up on this option, and we really should think of where we can implement and where you can use ocean acidification in different treaties that are already there. Because I'm academic, I really like to think about alternative ways of governance and alternative ways of lawmaking. And I've been looking into something called global experimentalist governance for a long time, which is a new way of governing that is more based on learning from local to international level. And if you're interested in that, I'm happy to talk to you about it some more after this presentation. So now let's quickly think, how does ocean acidification and food security come together? Now, while Ellie has already pointed that out really well in the first presentation, really shown us why it is important, I think the question is like, how do these, where are the problems or like who's actually being impacted by that and how can we deal with it? Here again, I don't want to read it out again, is the definition of food security that with all these different aspects that Ellie pointed out again at the beginning. So why should we, as a little recap, consider ocean acidification and food security together now? Well, ocean acidification has become not just an environmental problem, but it's really becoming a health problem and a food security problem. So we already know that blue foods provide protein to and essential micronutrients to billions of people, and we're relying more and more on aquatic foods. In the past 60 years, we have increased our consumption of these foods by 5 times. And the IPCC has high confidence that ocean warming and acidification is already affecting food production. So here you can really see these different ocean stressors are compounding each other and really lead to a problem. Ocean acidification can therefore reduce production of, for example, shellfish. They can degrade habitats like coral reefs, for example, and alter seafood quantity and quality. So again, this is not just an environmental issue, but it is also a human issue. So we have a huge problem though, because there's a big governance and equity problem here. Because those that are most affected by or might supposed to be impacted by food insecurity, those are the ones that have the least information about ocean acidification and about what is actually happening in their waters. There's first of all a big data gap because 70% of ocean acidification research has been conducted in global north, especially America and Europe. And so those that are actually mostly relying on protein from sources from the sea have the least information about what is actually happening in their waters and how ocean acidification is impacting the species that they most rely on. But at the same time, as we have seen, ocean acidification is such a difficult problem to govern. And while we're governing food security already through organizations like the Food and Agriculture Organization, governance of these two issues is not happening in the same place. As I said, ocean acidification might, for example, fit within the UNFCCC, but that's not where we really mainly speak about food security. At the same time, food security is being dealt with under the FAO, but that's not really a place where we talk about ocean acidification. Maybe you talk about climate change, but not about ocean acidification specifically. And we have really looked into these different organizations, specifically UNFCCC and the FAO, and see where they speak about these two issues. And I can tell you they never speak of them together, especially not in a connected way, one thinking about the other. So there's a lot of equity implementation implications for that, especially for those that depend on fisheries, the ones that have contributed least to CO2 emissions, and those that face the greatest food security risk. So there's really something that we need to work on here. So what does this mean now? How do we navigate this complexity? So first of all, OA is not an isolated environmental issue. It is connected with a lot of other environmental issues that are happening in the ocean. And it is not just an environmental, but it is a human and human health issue as well. It interferes with food security, public health, and it is also an equity challenge. And nevertheless, governance remains fragmented. Even the institutions that acknowledge that oceanification and food security are a problem are not thinking of them together. So future governance must be not just flexible, but it needs to be interdisciplinary. It needs to be inclusive and adapting to evolving science. So addressing OA and food security together really requires rethinking our governance and the systems that we have. So hopefully governance can evolve fast enough. Well, this is the paper and the book this presentation has been lending from. And if you're interested, please reach out. I'm happy to share these resources with you.
Well, thank you so much, Annika. What an awesome presentation. It's really, we're so grateful to have you as a colleague here at the OA Alliance and to share that type of work that you've been building for the last several years. And I think that's a great transition because while Annika sort of provides this really great sort of academic and even cerebral exercise, sort of looking at the ways that that acidification has or has not been showing up in these different spaces on the international governance side, I'm really excited to turn it over to Carly Kelso with Environmental Defense Fund. Because I think Carly, well, there might be some overlap in like main points, at least on the importance and significance of blue food. I think what you bring is a really on the ground assessment of actually sort of how is a group like EDF actually doing something about this on the ground? What are the types of initiatives that you're building? What are the type of partners that are really starting to move the needle on this? So really excited to turn it over to you. And with that, I'll be quiet.
Thank you so much, Jessie. Just to confirm, everyone can see my screen and presentation now?
Yeah, almost. For me at least. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jessie, and to the Alliance for having me today. I think that was the perfect intro and segue into my presentation about the Aquatic Blue Food Coalition. Again, my name is Carly Kelso. I work with the Environmental Defense Fund, and in my role, I also am the Secretariat for the Aquatic Blue Food Coalition. Today, I'm going to share what is this coalition, what have we achieved, and what are we looking towards in the future. But quickly, I do want to set the scene of why the coalition was formed. This information may not be new, but I always think it's important to really provide the full story about our work. As many of you know, our food systems are failing us. 1 in 10 people globally still face hunger, and our food systems are a major driver of climate change. They contribute up to 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and they're also the leading cause of biodiversity loss, water overuse, and land degradation. And yet, nutritional outcomes are worsening. Billions lack access to essential micronutrients. But aquatic blue foods are a part of this system, and they're underrepresented part of the system. And they can play an important role when we think about transitioning and transforming food systems, especially as climate continues to impact communities and our environment. As we already noted, 3 billion people depend on aquatic foods for their protein, and 1 in 5 for their vital micronutrients, such as omega-3s, iron, zinc, and vitamin A. And this is extremely important for women, children, and especially populations who are highly vulnerable to climate change. And these access to these nutrients are life-changing. They support health, especially the first 1,000 days of life and childhood development. These are really essential. And small scale and inland fisheries are the foundation of these systems. They provide 2/3 of the fish consumed directly go to human consumption. They support about 90% of the sector's 800 million jobs, and they deliver this highly nutritious food, especially in vulnerable coastal and rural communities. And then again, to the equity piece, particularly women, they make up about half of the workforce, but they do remain underrepresented in leadership and ownership, despite being the most exposed to climate change and food insecurity. So this is really a need, not just for food security, but more equitable and climate resilient policies. Aquatic foods also make key contributions to achieving the SDGs. When we did an analysis of the indicators, aquatic foods can contribute to 9 of the 7 SDGs. However, when we think about them and when they're discussed in these policy fora, they really just get put into life below water, which is SDG number 14. They're not considered or included in the other 8 where they do contribute and make progress on. They're also highly diverse. There's over 2,500 species of fish, invertebrates, plants, and algae that are harvested or farmed for food and human consumption. And this diversity means that blue foods can be tailored to different ecological and cultural contexts. But as we're all familiar with, this diversity of systems also means that there's a diversity of threats and vulnerabilities to climate change. We're seeing warming waters, which are changing wind patterns and rainfall. It's impacting productivity and location of marine fish stocks. Ocean acidification, I don't think you need to say how that's impacting. But there's also a loss of sea ice, hurricane, sea level rise, heat waves, drought, and flooding. And this is really also important for aquaculture because with climate change, there's an increased risk of pests and pathogen outbreaks and impacts to feed ingredients. So it's very vulnerable. However, there are opportunities for building the resilience of aquatic food systems and enhancing sustainable production of these systems in a climate change world. Decades of evidence show that depleted fisheries, which are carefully managed, can recover and be a sustainable source of food and nutrition. And well-managed fisheries have also been shown to be more resilient to climate impacts. Aquaculture has an even greater potential for climate adaptation. The species choices, the feeds and farm design can create climate resilience and safeguard against harvest losses. And models are showing that aquaculture production can be expanded sustainably to meet per capita demand for aquatic foods in every coastal country under all but the most severe climate scenarios. And also, when we think about aquatic food and aquaculture, especially with low trophic species like mussels, clams, and seaweeds, they could actually improve the environment in the places where they're raised. So they're an important solution, and they are opportunities for enhancing resilience. But despite all this information, much of which is relatively new, and I would say there's 2 major efforts that helped advance this body of information, Illuminating Hidden Harvest, which was led by FAO in partnership with Duke University, and then the Blue Food Assessment, which was led by Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, that included collaboration across 100 academics. really provided the strong foundation of why blue foods are important and really contributed to all the important pieces of information and evidence that I just shared. But they're still not, despite that, they're not well integrated into climate and nutrition strategies. They've been largely absent from key global platforms. And that's really how and why the Aquatic Blue Food Coalition was formed. We came together during the 2021 UN Food System Summit, which was the first of its summit ever to talk about solely food and how food systems play a really important role, especially in achieving SDGs. But during the prep work, aquatic foods were being left off the menu. So like-minded partners came together to make sure that this was a part of the effort and a part of the work that would be coming out of the UN Food System Summit. So the coalition was created. It means to champion blue foods for nutritious, equitable, sustainable, and climate resilient food systems. We're building on this evidence-based action, elevating underrepresented voices, and facilitating solutions for country needs. And this momentum is growing, and we're working to shift this narrative. And we're seeing the shift. Countries are starting to recognize aquatic foods as vital to climate and food security, but the momentum alone isn't enough, and we need more systems, funding, and coordination to turn this promise into reality. We are a group of over 65 members, and it's multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder. So we include 16 governments with leadership of the Secretariat, which includes Iceland. The government of Iceland is our chair. And then we have technical guidance from my organization, EDF, Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, and Oceana. A quick plug, this is open to all to participate. So please reach out, and I will give you my contact information if you want to learn more about joining the coalition. We have three objectives of the coalition. The first is to raise the profile of aquatic foods to make sure that there is recognition and awareness of how aquatic foods can play a role both in solutions, but also why we need to protect them and ensure we continue to have sustainable policies for them. And this includes at Rio conventions, at food and nutrition conferences, and across, we're trying to cut down silos, so at these major international fora. We're also trying to mobilize support for countries and stakeholders who are looking to integrate aquatic foods into their policies and drive knowledge exchange and place-based action. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of how we've worked on delivering these objectives. Over the last 4 years, we've held over and engaged in over 75 global engagements. And again, we're trying to break out and not just have conversations with ocean audiences, but reaching out and being active in climate, food systems, and biodiversity conversations, because aquatic foods really do touch on all these different and important efforts. And we've been active across the world, not just centered in the US or in Europe, but really trying to be active because this is a global issue. We've also worked on practical guidance to help governments and policymakers to integrate blue foods into their policies. The picture on the left is our guidelines for how to integrate blue foods into national climate strategies. It provides, 6 ways and policy pathways to integrate aquatic foods when governments are thinking about their national climate strategies, both from mitigation as well as adaptation and other opportunities that they're integrated. The second is a white paper on school meals. School meals are often not included or not considering aquatic foods when they're building these programs. So we're contributing to thinking through what does this look like and how can we help make that connection with these programs, especially given the nutritious value of aquatic foods. And then we're also working at the regional level. We are a global coalition, but we do recognize that we want this to touch ground. We can't just be at international fora. So how can we really mobilize and catalyze momentum? And Jesse spoke to this earlier, but at our Oceans Conference in Mombasa in June, we had a meeting. It was a high-level roundtable on Africa aquatic foods. And one of the key outcomes was endorsement by governments for a champions network. This meeting brought together 50 senior government leaders to strengthen political leadership, foster peer learning, and coordinate action for blue foods in national development, food security, and climate policies across Africa. And this group identified not just the endorsement of the champions, but outlines the initial priorities. So integrating blue foods into NDCs and NEPs. The second is reducing post-harvest loss, and the third is developing a unified Africa position on aquatic foods, especially ahead of the next COP, COP32, which will be in Africa. So really bringing that regional perspective and leadership and voice on the topic. This fall in September, we are having an event in the Caribbean. The Caribbean is estimated to contribute less than 1% of global capture fisheries and aquaculture production, and is actually one of the only regions in the world where that's declining. So we're partnering with a local organization on a stakeholder workshop, which is going to feature speakers from across the Caribbean. It's going to include presentations, focused discussions, shared experience, and practical case studies from the region, all to work in the development of a shared regional roadmap, which will help to unlock the vast potential of aquaculture production and investment, and how bringing these people together to do this in a sustainable way, and including voices and really driven from people in the region. My last example of how the coalition has worked is we took the guidelines that I showed you earlier, and my organization, EDF, has been active in Mexico for about 20 years. We had a similar workshop with over 70 stakeholders in Mexico around how aquatic foods could help achieve their ambitions nationally, from climate to food to development, and had a workshop. And then a year later, Mexico actually updated their NDCs using the exact recommendations from that workshop. So really engaging with stakeholders on how this could play a role in what they're trying to achieve. But it's more work to be done, especially on climate. So Jesse asked me to share some ideas and some thoughts about how we are engaging what can be done. So aquatic foods, we still have to move away from the margins into the mainstream of climate policy. So what does that look like? That includes embedding aquatic foods into NDCs and NAPs and the mechanisms and pathways under the UNFCCC. Also recognizing this dual role that supporting fisheries and aquaculture is supporting food systems and protecting ocean ecosystems. They're not against each other, and you could have wins in both of these spheres. Also, increasing access to climate finance. We heard a lot about the equity piece, and this is continuing to be true for aquatic foods in climate finance. It's really hard and it's difficult. This funding is hard to apply for, and it's difficult to reach the ground, especially for small scale fishers, Indigenous people, women, and coastal communities. So we need to break down that barrier. And then strengthening collaboration across climate, food, biodiversity, and ocean agendas to avoid fragmented policy approaches. And from the domestic level, that includes really including fisheries and aquaculture in national policy and investment plans. No longer just thinking about them from an ocean perspective, but how can they play a role in nutrition and development plans at the national level. Also supporting sustainable and efficient value chains, such as cold chain infrastructure that could reduce emissions, but also reduce food loss. Investing in science, innovation, and data to inform evidence-based policymaking, and again, equity, ensuring equitable governance that strengthens livelihoods while conserving aquatic food systems. So wrapping up, I do want to share our email and give a pitch to explore our website. This website, we have an engagement hub there, which has a list of how we engage, where we'll be, what upcoming events we're planning. But also there's a handful of technical resources, including the guidelines and also partner resources on this topic. So I just think it's a great wealth of information, and I hope you have the opportunity to explore. And I also included my email for any questions after this presentation. Thank you again, Jesse, and to the Alliance for having me.
Oh. Well, thank you so much, Carly. That was an excellent presentation, and they do build on each other very nicely. And it's wonderful to see the work that EDF and that you are part of leading. It really is inspiring. I think you guys are some of the best actors, really kind of bringing this together at the regional scale. And so it's really awesome to have you here with us. And how do we, as an ocean acidification community, which I think we consider ourselves mostly on this call, how do we continue to work with groups like EDF? And so we're thinking about these kind of policies more holistically, and that acidification is part of many types of different parameters that are being considered when you're thinking about risk assessments, mitigation, adaptation, needed science, et cetera. So that's really appreciated. I think what we'll do now is I will call we'll have Carly and Annika come back at the end of the call so we can stand for questions then. But for maybe the next 20 minutes or so, I'd like to call our three panelists to turn your cameras on. That's going to be Dr. Mitchell Lennon with the School of Law at the University of Aberdeen in the United Kingdom. That'll be Councilman J. Guadalupe Castaneda with the Makah Tribal Council, and Maximilian Schwarz with the European Bureau for Conservation and Development. Hi, Mitchell. And
Hi, can you hear me okay?
yes, I can.
Awesome.
And Max, great to see you. And then
Nice to see you
Councilman
tonight.
Castaneda. Or Chris, I guess, if we can. Yeah, sorry, yeah, I see you there. Lupe Castaneda, wonderful to see you. We'll get you spotlighted. Great. Well, that was a good discussion, and I'm excited to turn it over to you three for a little bit more color commentary. You were all involved in different aspects of this work. So I do have my questions, of course, for you all, but feel free to really take liberties. And we just want, I wanted to invite your perspective to this group. So don't feel like you need to be too faithful to my questions if there's other things you are thinking about from those conversations. But Mitchell, I think, one thing, I'll start with you, is that, kind of building on Annika's deep dive on the international law and policy side, you are an expert in this field, particularly on the fisheries side. And I'd love to get your perspective about the roles and responsibilities of entities. We spoke a little bit like the UNFCCC, but also entities like the FAO, UN Law of the Sea, regional fisheries management organizations. How can they be helping countries better take inventory and respond to these types of impacts?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much, Jesse. And I'll try and kind of brief. Can you hear me okay? That's fine. Okay. I will try and explain this sort of briefly as well. And I guess just a little bit about my background. I mean, I did my PhD on climate change and fisheries law, and this we were primarily really just focusing on ocean warming, okay, and marginalizing ocean acidification. I think this is kind of reflected in some of these institutions as well. So, it's easy for us sometimes to say, we can think we need to stop thinking about these institutions in isolation. But I think from Annika's presentation, we can see that they are working in isolation a lot of the time. But we know that ocean acidification sits at the intersection of sort of climate change, biodiversity, fisheries management, food security, and then of course and human rights as well, which I think sometimes we can forget about. So responding to those effectively, we need legal and policy regimes to operate in a mutually supportive way in Norton science. So I guess we'll start. I guess the lowest hanging fruit really is the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. So they have this primary responsibility for tackling ocean acidification. But again, as Annika said, there is no target for CO2, and there's nothing specific. But they do provide the framework for adaptation, finance, technology transfer, capacity building, all these kind of things. And all these are essential if we're going to deal and maintain food security as one of the systems change, right? So then a bit more kind of granular point. I mean, ocean acidification has been discussed at the UNFCCC. It was recognised as a slow onset event under the climate change regime in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. But and in that decision, it was really relegated to a footnote, okay? And little attention had really been paid to that issue after. But I mean, more encouragingly, since sort of 2021, we've got this formal integration of the ocean into the UN climate process, and we've got this annual climate change dialogue, which is really a lot of us know each other from. And that's created a nice space, to discuss issues, including ocean acidification under this broader umbrella of ocean-based climate action. And promisingly, I think from state practice, we're starting to see more countries sort of recognising the importance of blue food systems within their nationally determined contributions and their national adaptation plans, although there's kind of more scope and more ambition for progress there. But the other point I was going to make, and I do believe actually it was Iceland that made this point at the Ocean Climate Dialogue, that the blue foods wasn't didn't really get much of a mention at all, let alone ocean acidification of blue foods in the last Ocean Climate Dialogue. So I think there's a lot more advocacy that we could be doing to include that in that space. And then onto UN Convention Law of the Sea, which to be honest is my bread and butter.
Can I interrupt you very quickly, Mitchell, before you get to
Yes.
UN Law of the Sea? To
Am I
me, you
taking too
sound a
long?
little quiet. Is there
Right,
something
bear
in
with.
front of your speakers that you can change or something on
Uh,
volume input?
How does that sound?
There you are. Thank you. Sorry.
Hey, okay.
All right.
That's awesome. Yeah, well, I know sometimes there's a lot of the sea person. It's okay to be underwater. Bear with.
Yes.
Okie dokie. Have I got enough time in my open time, or
Yeah, no, you go ahead. Tell us about
I can
Law of the
keep
Sea.
So yeah, Law of the Sea. And again, this is the other thing. I mean, we're having talked about the UN climate change space as well. Sometimes the Law of the Sea doesn't even get a look in when we talk about the ocean as well, which is another issue. But so all of the Sea, UN Conventional Law of the Sea, or the UNCLOS, this is our overarching kind of legal framework for ocean governance. Okay, and it establishes this obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment, and it requires states to cooperate regionally and globally, both with protection and preservation of the marine environment and fisheries management as well. So this was negotiated decades before climate change and ocean acidification. I wouldn't say it was widely understood. There was scientific evidence. I think a lot of the negotiators knew about this. It wasn't a mystery back in the 70s and the 80s. We did know about it. We knew about the connection between the atmosphere and the ocean for various reasons, but it didn't really make it into the text. Okay, but the provisions in the convention are sufficiently broad enough to be interpreted to encompass various different changes, including technology, climate change, that sort of thing. And UNCLOS requires states to manage fisheries, and both within their national jurisdiction and on the high seas if they have an interest in fishing those. And you need to take into account of environmental and economic factors. Okay, so the provisions are sort of drafted broadly enough that you can take in different changes. Ocean acidification is obviously an environmental factor, right? So then importantly in 2024, we look at this International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea advisory opinion on climate change, and we've got a lot. And given the kind of scientific evidence that we have much greater clarity that greenhouse gases, including CO2, constitute marine pollution under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and that states are then required through this exercise of due diligence to adapt fisheries conservation and management using the best available science. And it represents an important shift in our understanding of states' obligations. States are under a legal obligation to adapt their fisheries and management to the effects of both climate change and ocean acidification. And I think my last point on this is that the tribunal itself did differentiate between climate change and ocean acidification. And I think that's a really important point. Yeah. And then finally, just on FAO and then fisheries management organizations, sorry if I'm taking too much time. Now, as a fisheries lawyer, an international fisheries lawyer, I'm a big advocate for the great work that FAO does. It plays a critically important role. It translates science into international fisheries policy. It helps deal with, develop technical guidance with the assistance of states. It can strengthen national capacity. It supports resilient fisheries and aquaculture systems. But as climate change and ocean acidification have started to alter fish productivity, distribution of species, viability of marine aquaculture, and impact livelihoods as well and food security, it becomes more and more important, obviously, for the work that the FAO does. But I think one area where there is this kind of important gap, really, through much of the technical guidance and guidelines that FAO has produced, is that climate change and ocean acidification are either lumped together or ocean acidification is left out completely. And so the focus primarily really is ocean warming. And while the two are clearly linked, as we know, they affect marine ecosystems in different ways and they require different policy responses, as we've heard already. So I think the challenge really for FAO is a sort of more kind of granular work on OA, specifically in the way that affects livelihoods. And then finally, with RFMOs, regional fishery management organizations, I guess this is where adaptation is a bit more tangible on the high seas. They're responsible really for conserving and managing shared and highly migratory fish stocks. They need to do that based on the best available science. And so therefore, if the science is telling you that the ocean is both warming and acidifying, you need to respond to that. And the tribunal has confirmed that you need to do that. So the challenge really, I think, with RFMOs is that they are working very hard or states are kind of their members are sort of advocating to do more with just climate change more generally and ocean acidification. However, there remains kind of huge issues with capacity, especially for their members to either report science or just participate more generally. So I think this is a big challenge for our FMOs in the future. They're facing a lot of different challenges at the moment. And then I think finally, I think another important point, I think the most significant development, and I've argued this in recent research, is that we're seeing adaptation move beyond just simply good policy or good idea. Okay, so fish move around because of warming and acidification, and there's a practical obligation to, there's a practical need to adapt in the first place. But when we read, and the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea has confirmed that then you've got this legal obligation to adapt. But if you read these, there's two other advisory opinions that I'll talk about a little bit later on from both the International Court of Justice and the Inter-American Court. When you read these three together, it's starting to suggest that then adapting fisheries governance to ocean acidification, and climate change is being understood more as a legal obligation rather than just a nice thing to have, rather than just a good policy outcome. Okay, and this kind of changes the conversation of whether states should adapt and how institutions such as the UNFCCC, FAO, and RFMOs can kind of help states implement the obligations that they already have. So yeah, I'll maybe stop there if that's okay.
That's great. And I'll come back to it. I think I'm gonna conclude with you on coming back to that International Court of Justice and what that actually means a little bit later on. But thank you so much for that. And thank you for being a author on our policy brief and these papers that we've been working on and really shaping how the Alliance thinks about leveraging the issue of ocean acidification in some of these legal landscapes. But you mentioned a lot there, particularly on the adaptation side, and you also mentioned a little bit and touched on that there is nexus not just to climate mitigation, adaptation, health, but also human rights. And what I want to bring into this discussion, a long-time members and leaders of the OA Alliance are the Makah Tribal Council, the Makah tribe in the northwest corner of North America, and into Canada. And we have with us Councilman J. Guadalupe Castaneda. Councilman Castaneda, it's lovely to see you twice now this year, so thank you for joining us. And, you know, when we got started at the Alliance, one of our first really important leadership shaping ideas came from the Makah tribe, and particularly the discussion around food sovereignty as something that is different but adjacent to food security. So can you just share from your perspective with this type of conversation, what is food sovereignty and why is it important from this discussion?
Well, I'll just start off with in the 1855 Treaty of Nia Bay, during negotiations, our Chief Tekawith brought Territorial Governor Isaac Stevens out on a canoe in the negotiations because we were giving up 90% of our land, and he brought him onto the ocean, and he said, the sea, this is my country," because he knew the importance of fishing, whaling, and sealing, and the connection. And the distinction is that food security asks whether there will be enough seafood. And food sovereignty asks whether we hold the authority in the relationship, the right to harvest, the duty to steward the lands that we've been doing since the beginning of time. In the culture, our foods carry. You can import protein. You cannot import a way of life. And we are an ocean-going people. We are ocean hunters. On the farthest northwest point, we're the people of the Cape. We've been harvesting since the beginning of time. The 1855 treaty reserved the right to fish, whale, and seal at our usual and accustomed grounds. And then reaffirmed in the 1974 U.S. versus Washington, the Bolt decision. The stakes for the Makah are serious. Fisheries are 50 to 70% of the economy. and 99% of the macaw households rely on fishing and hunting for part of their diet. This is subsistence, economy, and identity at once. A treaty right to harvest means little if acidification removes the fish. When ocean acidification corrodes shellfish and disrupts the food web and erodes a legally reserved right, this is a matter of government obligation to the food web. It erodes a legally reserved right, and an international body should hear it directly from the macaw people and other Indian governments and tribal governments who are on the front lines. We're not just a stakeholder category.
Well said. Thank you so much, Councilman. And you bring so much kind of reality to this, and really appreciate also in the sovereignty lens, just as you said, not you can import protein, but you can't import a way of life. There's sovereignty in that, but also just to your point about bringing up the Bolt decision, and in the Macaw's case being a treaty tribe, having really truly the government obligation of Washington State to ensure those harvesting rights, I think is a very powerful example of that sovereignty that the Macaw holds as a government, equal to national governments, equal to state governments in this conversation, and where the legal balance is met there, or the legal obligations are met there in the context of climate change. So I really appreciate you bringing that to the Alliance, as you always have, and the way that we think about this work. The other thing I just want to ask you before I'll head over to you, Max, is, the Macaw has been working over the last several years on something called the First Foods Initiative. Do you want to share anything about what that work is, and if there's any overlap with things like the Ocean Acidification Action Plan? And feel encouraged. You're allowed to say as much or as little as you'd like, or if there's anything else you'd like this group to know, sort of about the programmatic focus of the Macaw on First Foods.
Is that me, or did you say Max?
No, sorry, over to you. Yeah, if you want to share anything about the First Foods program, you're invited.
Yeah, sorry. I thought you said I thought you said Max. I'm sorry, I was waiting. Yeah, so with the First Foods Initiative, I mean, returning our people to First Foods has been a personal priority of mine. When we as a people harvest and we prepare and share the first foods, we restore a relationship to the ocean, pass knowledge to the next generation, and reclaim a way of life that colonization and the changing ocean have both tried to take from us. And we have a really good working design with that unites three different tribal bodies. We have the Office of Marine Affairs with the Port of Neah Bay, the Sophie Tredovic Indian Center, and the Macaw Culture and Research Center. So marine management, community health, and culture sit at one table. With community members, we identify a pilot list of key first foods asserted to climate and ocean acidification risks to harvest. In the habitat, the risk is to each one's habitat, abundance, distribution, and quality, and took back into the community through First Foods gatherings. And quality, and in a survey which traditions, roles, and access are most at risk, our people define which foods matter, we assess the threats, and on terms, we set the responses. And I believe getting these first foods back into our diets has been missing since, we've had these in our diet since the beginning of time. And that's why it's been a personal priority of mine to get all these foods back into our diet, because it is missing from our diet, and foods are medicine, and the federal government is realizing that now, and we've known that since the beginning of time.
That's great, and thank you so much for sharing that. And we can also, Anthony, I'm looking at you or Chris or yourself, Councilman, if there's any links to first food programs through kind of the website that you want to share, or anything that you would like to share with this community about macaw leadership or programmatic focus, feel encouraged to put that there. But with that, I'll just kind of pick up on the fact that, talking about something like a first foods program, talking about the impacts of climate change or acidification and how you're assessing risk. I do then want to turn it over to you, Max, and really happy that we have been able to meet a little bit more now on this international side. And I actually don't know as much about the body of work that you hold as I do some of these other colleagues. So I'm really excited to hear your perspective on this conversation. But moving a little bit from that, like locally assessing threats, as Councilman Castaneda mentioned, how do you think about, I mean, tell us maybe a little bit more about your focus and what you work on from the European Bureau of Conservation and Development perspective on this bigger picture, but also kind of what is the role of that local data and science in really thinking about that local response that's most meaningful, on the adaptation resilience side, or even sort of on the food sovereignty side, as Councilman Castaneda has been mentioning. So yeah, so over to you to kind of share your perspectives on the importance of that local scale information and how you're supporting that in different ways.
Thanks, Jesse. Much appreciated being here. I'm joining you guys from the Convention on Biological Diversity's SBSTA meeting in Nairobi. And I say that I just want to jump on what Councilman Castaneda said. We're hearing a lot of support for IPLC related issues and bringing that language into the negotiations discussions here, which is really, really great. So I hope that this kind of strengthens the engagement and the perspectives that you bring into these kind of forums. However, climate change and food security and sovereignty, perhaps because it's not necessarily the mandate of the CBD, but I argue that it should still be mentioned. These kind of issues are not really coming up too much in our discussions here. And this kind of feeds into the first thing that I kind of want to raise, and it's already been mentioned by a couple of the other speakers. So apologize if I am repeating what has already been said by a couple of others, but it's this kind of notion that there is a lot of fragmentation around the issues of fisheries, aquaculture, climate change, food security, etc., where fisheries management, aquaculture production system, climate change, biodiversity conservation and sustainable use, and food security are often treated separately, both at national and international level. And again, it's been highlighted here that fish stocks, they move across jurisdictions as oceans warm and acidify. This will change from what we know historically. Feed, seafood, and labor move through international supply chains. Yet the fisheries and aquaculture agencies or environmental and climate institutions, health departments, and food security programs often operate independently. And so it's very crucial to coordinate and strengthen transboundary governments. And I think in light of kind of the overarching issue that I want to speak on that you mentioned in terms of missing links, Jesse, I think that's kind of an overarching umbrella that this is a major institutional missing link. I don't think it's something groundbreaking that I'm saying here, but I just wanted to highlight that. So kind of just to bring that message home that in reality, these systems or these areas form one coupled kind of aquatic food system where climate affects ecosystems and production affects prices, livelihoods, and diets, and then food system decisions affect emissions, biodiversity, and communities. So having said that, if I may, Jesse, jump into a little bit more kind of concrete missing links that I think possibly need to be highlighted. And they do build on some of the issues that Annika raised and Carly, Mitchell, I guess kind of everyone. I think there are elements that I will mention that have already been highlighted in some respect. So one of the first things that I'm thinking in terms of a main missing link is that production is not the same thing as nutrition. So when we think about fish and seafood production and distribution, we're often emphasizing tons of fish caught or harvested and an economic value added, but we're rarely tracking whether production supplies protein, iron, micronutrients, macronutrients, omega-3 fatty acids, etc., to the people who need them. And climate change, and I apologize, Mitchell noted that FAO's work gap is that lumping ocean acidification and climate change together. I'm not an FAO representative, but I will probably do a little bit of the same because I don't know enough about ocean acidification as a solo topic. But I mean, climate change as such can alter this composition and nutrient content even when total production might not change. And there's actually been research done by William Chung from UBC, I believe, and Christina Hicks, if some of you on the call know them, which projects that that there will be particular severe nutrient losses in tropical lower income developing countries, many SIDS who rely very heavily on aquatic foods, and with aquaculture only partially being able to compensate for declining capture fisheries. So I think that's a key missing link there, this whole notion about production not being the same or equal to nutrition. Then the second thing that I'd like to highlight is that climate assessments, in my opinion, as far as I'm concerned, often stop at the farm or fishing ground, whereas climate change affects not only fish abundance, distribution, and the likes, and farm productivity, but also landing sites, cold storage processing, market access, all the post-harvest issues. And Carly highlighted some of the issues that the Aquatic Blue Food Coalition is kind of pursuing with some initiatives around cold chain infrastructure. So this is also something that I think is a missing link in our discussions, because actually post-harvest pathways determine how much fish actually reaches consumers, and reducing spoilage and improving processes are key to strengthening food security, and climate change has severe and direct implications for this. Then I want to highlight, and this also aligns with what Councilman Castaneda highlighted about the vulnerabilities that different actors, communities, regions will face in light of climate change, and that these vulnerabilities, they differ sharply by location and production system. And so climate-induced hazards will occur together and interact with poverty, with governance infrastructures that might not necessarily be as strong, with conflict, and there's all these interactions that are occurring. And another paper that I read in relation to kind of this discussion here is that more than 90% of global aquatic food production has been assessed as facing substantial exposure to human-induced environmental change. But then it stresses that this vulnerability varies by location and production system. And maybe kind of linked to that is also the notion then that climate change shifts access to fisheries and aquatic food resources. But I'll play a bit of the devil's advocate here. This cannot be positive and negative. So there are losses and opportunities that will be felt through these shifts in access to fisheries resources. Going to the losses first, perhaps, is some work that I looked into, done by the Pacific community, that they modeled that under the current emission projections, around 20% of the tuna catches taken in Pacific Island EEZ, so exclusive economic zones, could shift to the high seas by 2050, which seems like a long way away, but I think that's actually kind of around the corner. And this could actually have severe consequences negatively for local livelihoods, economies, and that roughly around $90 million a year could be lost in access revenues across Pacific SIDS. However, on the other side of the coin, there's species that are moving poleward into deeper water, north, south, which will mean that some fisheries and fishing nations will gain access to some commercial species that previously were uncommon or absent. I think that the UK, for example, now is getting a thriving tuna fishery in the North Sea or in an area close to where they're fishing. And this can create new fisheries and market products. It also impacts fishing seasons and opportunities. So in light of that, I think, and this links also maybe to the institutional issues and processes that need to be strengthened that Mitchell mentioned related to RFMOs, for example. We need to pursue adaptive fisheries management regimes and build climate change into fisheries, management measures and policy, both at national level, at the RFMO international level. And this is crucial to kind of keep pace with climate change induced stock shifts. Yeah, I can leave it there, or I can go in a little bit into the role that local data and science play in building a bridge, if you want, Jesse.
No, this is great. I appreciate, I think you've given us lots of really excellent, succinct takeaways. So I think that's a really appreciated set of interventions there, Max. And I think what I'll ask, I think I might turn it, I mean, yeah, I just really appreciate your real strong point that production is not the same as nutrition. And also thinking about, I mean, I think that that's just a super important takeaway as we are thinking about the responsibilities and sort of the human rights aspect and the legal rights aspect of this work. The other thing, obviously, about climate assessments often stopping at farm or fishing grounds and then thinking about that not capturing larger climate change impacts in post-harvest. So I think, and obviously the differentiation and human introduced environmental change and vulnerabilities there. So I think it's a really appreciated. And one thing I've also really appreciated about your work is at the international level, I think we do see, and last point, I'll turn it over to you, Mitchell, for a closing comment, and then I'll ask if anyone has questions. I want to have a little bit of time for that if that's meaningful. But I think that Max and Mitchell, you guys have really been on the international side of this, paying attention to the UNFCCC, paying attention to FAO, paying attention to UN Law of the Sea and where this is showing up. Mitchell, I'll put you on the spot, and Annika and Carly, if you guys want to come on, and Annika, you might have something you want to add to this question after Mitchell. But it's really an open question, and I guess I'll be vulnerable in my acidification hat answering the open question, which is we go back and forth in the acidification community about whether siloing acidification, calling out acidification as something unique, is helpful, or whether it's just sort of like climate ocean change, and that includes warming, acidification, oxygen loss, and some other variables. And how do we parse those? Is there a need to parse those? You mentioned, Mitchell, that recently an International Court of Justice opinion calling out acidification uniquely as a pollutant in addition to climate change that needs to be governed and regulated or is causing a harm. Succinctly, because I do want to leave a little bit of room for if anyone has questions or want to put those in the chat, we can start queuing them up. But do you see value, or what is the value of pulling out acidification as a solo topic when we think about leveraging international responsibilities? Is there one or is there not? How should we be thinking about the role of the issue of acidification and being most useful to getting more countries what they need?
I think at the international level, I mean, we see this at the dialogue, for example, quite a lot. It's hard enough to get a discussion on blue foods and climate change generally when there's people wanting to talk about marine CBDR and blue carbon and all these other topics that fall under the umbrella of ocean-based climate action. So at the international level, it's challenging enough. I think this is a really tough point, and this has really been food for thought for me as someone that's worked on shifting fish stocks, because fish stocks shift because of warming, and they shift because of acidification, and they shift because of deoxygenation as well, right? So the response to the shifting is for me the legal problem, I guess, right? So I think this is really challenging. I don't really know if I have an answer, and I don't want to do the cop out, which is what every lawyer says when it says it depends. But I think if we're discussing food security, particularly from a subsistence perspective, if we are talking about things like shellfish and so on, and I think it would be helpful to do that. I At the same time, when we're still having these conversations, we can still just we can draw these things out, but we're not isolating it. I think if that does that make sense. I think we're just amplifying the fact that ocean acidification is maybe not getting the attention it deserves within all these other impacts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Annika,
Yeah.
anything you want to add to that about the unique role that the topic of acidification can play in sort of the mitigation side?
Yeah, well, I don't want to conflate like climate change and ocean acidification. I think it's a good way to harness the wish for financing and to show that climate change is maybe not as simple as we sometimes think, like just reduce emissions, no problem, right? So I think for some countries it has more serious impacts than for others. And I think this is a good way of saying we actually don't know what is going on in front of our coast, and we really need to understand these things better. We need more money, we need more support. And at the same time, we're the ones that contribute least. So I think it's a good way of saying climate change has impacts that are maybe not seen yet, but we need more financing to find out, and we are the ones that are going to be most impacted by that. I think in that way, without putting all in the same pot and saying it's the same thing, I think it's a good way of saying we don't understand everything and we need more money and resources to understand better and make wise choices, hopefully.
Great. Well, I know that we're at time, so I want to be respectful. I'm very comfortable usually going over time, as anyone who works with us knows that I tend to keep people longer, which is not always appropriate. But I will say if I do want to leave, if there's any questions in the chat, I'm seeing lots of appreciation for all of your presentations. So Anthony, I'll ask your question. Anthony from PAVE in Nigeria, how can you support us in the use of the policy brief to mainstream OA and national policies? Yes. So, Annika, do you want to take that about sort of the food security policy brief, but sort of other aspects of the alliance and mainstreaming OA and national policies in Nigeria and West Africa? What are the mainstream policies that we're sort of recommending governments look at?
I mean, even though this is not my specialty within the alliance, we've been working a lot with East Africa. Sorry, did you say, did you say it was West Africa, Nigeria?
This is West Africa, Nigeria, but I'm thinking more on the leadership circle side on NDCs and now.
Yeah, I see. So basically, we're happy to work with any government that is interested. So we have been trying to see, because we're recognizing it's not easy for everyone to just make their own ocean acidification action plan and just, have all the resources to put into that and making a plan over the next years what they want to do. We have been trying to kind of channel other ways of integrating ocean acidification where you're already working on climate issues, for example. So some of those are, for example, just working on your NDCs and NAPs. How can you integrate ocean acidification within those? Or sustainable ocean plans, for example, are also a good way, especially for Africa. Those two are ways of integrating ocean acidification without coming up with a whole new concept of how to do that. And that can just entail, for example, thinking about fisheries, or when you talk about fisheries or ocean acidification has an impact on that, as we just heard during this webinar. So when you think about fisheries, don't forget ocean acidification, or when you're thinking about, for example, coastal input of nutrients, think about how that might impact ocean acidification, etc. So we're not trying to put like all these hurdles in your way. Instead, we want to work with all of you to make sure that there's easy and simple ways of integrating more information about ocean acidification in the policies that you're already working on. So if you're interested, just please reach out to any of us, and we're able to help your government, or also bring scientists from the country and the government together if that's helpful. So yeah, please feel free to reach out.
Great. Thanks so much, Annika. And I've got one more question from Melissa that I'll voice, and it's for you, Max, I think first, but I'll open it to others. I think Carly, you might have some thoughts on this. So as mentioned, Max clarified the important point that production, measured by catch or abundance, et cetera, is not a good indicator of food or nutrition contribution. So what are some other indicators or proxies that might be more useful for measuring and evaluating the links between changing oceans and food security? What would be good or new indicators or something to track, and especially with that lens of what Councilman Castaneda mentioned on first food. So Max, and then open to anyone else.
Thanks, Jesse. I'll jump on what you just highlighted that Councilman Castaneda mentioned it. I think additional indicators that need to be taken into consideration or that we should be measuring and evaluating relate also to access and affordability. So I think that directly links to what Councilman Castaneda was highlighting, where we need to know kind of whether communities, operators have access to traditional fishing to fishing grounds, to productive sites, the availability of culturally important foods for them, perhaps. Also, kind of market impact and incentives, I think, might be important to take into consideration when it comes to climate change, like what kind of price fluctuations might climate change be bringing about. I think off the top of my head, those are two additional considerations that maybe we should think about, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Carly, anything you want to add to that, and then any others?
Sure. I would just add, I think it highlights the silos actually that we still have in government, because there are a lot of indicators that say the Ministry of Fisheries and not sorry, Ministries of Health and more public health initiatives are tracking, but they're not looking at the pathways where opportunities where aquatic foods could help move the needle and help enhance nutritional outcomes. For example, we worked in Oaxaca, Mexico on a school feeding program where they started tracking nutritional indicators before the transformation of the school meals, and they were tracking anemia. And that was actually not a fisheries ministry doing that. That was the health ministry. But then when aquatic foods were brought in, then they continued to track that indicator of anemia and saw that there was a reduction. So how can we bring these government silos, break them down, and how can we have existing initiatives actually think about a more holistic systems approach?
Councilman, anything you want to add to that? Oh, and you're on mute. Sorry, I should have said. There you go.
Yeah. So is it relating to the security of how long, the fish will be there and the supply of it? I mean,
Yeah.
going to that, like the security is, it's about supply, and then sovereignty is about the authority and the relationship. Our treaty reserve right to harvest, our stewardship on the roll, even stewarding these lands when we were whaling, we put our harpoons down 12 years before, the federal government and any other agencies, the commercial whaling stopped. So we've known about, decline and how to adjust to it, and stewardship and stewarding these lands since the beginning of time. So it is our identity as ocean people. So I go back to the point where you can import protein, but you can't import a way of life.
Thank you so much, Councilman, for being here with us today, and honestly for all the leadership the Makah has shown in this topic of acidification, but also first food and sovereignty, and bringing sort of that lens to the work that we do here and how we talk about this issue. It's been hugely impactful. Last quick question, Mohammed Ahmed, do you have is it a quick question that we can finish up with? Over to you if I see a hand raised.
Yeah, thank you for this is insightful webinar. I'm just there's something about the pH and ocean acidification and the climate change, because there's are it is the same time with while the seawater temperature increases, the dissolving of carbon dioxide is decreasing. So the pH it is not. They are most linked to parameters here. When we're talking about the food security and ocean acidification and the climate change in the same time, we must know that about the adaptive behavior for this is a species at the oceans or at the sea, because they may be migration at the depth, more depths, or something like this. So we must know the how can this species adapt first at the oceans by me. We can making some lab experiments at our labs to making to match the future scenario for the pH decreasing here. It is the most something here. I found it when I read most of papers coming from North America and Europe. I found that the pH was 8 or 7.97, and this is most cities just having some industries and companies with the most CO carbon dioxide emissions. And while are here in Egypt, our seas are surface seawater temperature is higher than more in Europe or North America, and we found that the pH is decreased to 7.8. So it's not only the carbon dioxide, or it's not only the ocean acidification's resources or sources. It's differ from one regions to another regions. It's not only depends on the industry or something. There's most something biggest than we are looking here. So there's a lot of uh, factors or sources affecting the ocean acidification. It's not only our carbon dioxide emissions, maybe human behavior. All of these things just affecting the distributions, as a Maximilian talking about it, distributions of the species in the oceans, and affecting our production from the oceans or stock in the oceans, because we don't know how this species is adapted and where we can find it exactly at which depths. Maybe it's going more depth, so we can't get our normal production every year.
Oh,
So thank you for all this webinar. And it's the only questions, just the differences between the pH in Europe and North America and Egypt, while the temperature there in Europe and North America, it's lower than here.
yes.
And we having faced the lower pH at our Mediterranean Sea.
Yeah. No, it's an excellent.
Thank you.
No, thank you so much. It's an excellent point. I see Annika shaking her head a lot up and down, and I know Max might have gotten into this if we had gone a little bit more on the local science, but I'll just I'll end by appreciating that point. And I think a lot of people not in the acidification community don't realize just what you said, that a lot of the acidification work in lab is evaluating that adaptive behavior or adaptive potential of different species under different pH or aragonite saturation states. And so I think that is actually something where, around the world trying to really think about what are the most meaningful experiments for the variables and variation in local waters, and obviously the Mediterranean being very specific as well, and recognizing that it's not just that CO2 driver, it's some of these other signals from that local kind of local runoff and other contributing factors. So I think it's an excellent point, and I think that's exactly the marriage that we're trying to make more through the Alliance, is how do we elevate that type of OA research into these larger risk assessments and investments, and what is the most meaningful set of research projects that's going to fill out a larger fisheries policy in one location. So really appreciate that. And everyone, yeah, sorry if folks had to leave. I'll just say we will send out the recording, and we'll send out all the links to the different resources that were mentioned. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for our speakers, those that you had to run and are still here. We appreciate it. And what a wonderful showing on a summertime webinar. And thank you for those that got up early or stayed late or got pulled out of meetings that you were already in. So thanks so much, guys.